Well, the significance to me is the insignificance. This is a historic site that belonged to an ordinary farming family. And unlike a lot of historic sites that focus on the importance of the individual, this house is a big part of the story of early Niagara and the regular everyday people who built our community. When you connect to those people and start to see how they live their lives, then they become very human to you, and it really opens up your understanding of what life was like for people, for our ancestors, the early Niagara residents.
How did you go about coming across this house and taking ownership of it?
Well, for me, it started as a family history research project, actually. The house was built by my fifth great grandfather, John Brown, who was a Butler's Ranger, a loyalist, who settled here around 1785 and subsequently built the house. So, studying him, learning about my family roots, I came across the house. At that point, it was at risk, and my wife and I ultimately, after a lot of conversation, set up a charitable organization to buy the house to protect it.
You have plans to really utilize this historic site as something that can be really reflective of the future as well of this city.
Our philosophy is if a building's going to be preserved, it's because it has a meaning and a purpose to the community today. And we want this to be a community space. We like to say our doors open. This is going to be a place for the community to gather, as they did over 200 years ago when there used to be church services and community gatherings held in this house. It was also a tavern pre-World War of 1812. So we think that our plans of making it a community space is a continuation of that history.
There is a shed, I guess we would call it, a cabin, the Norton Cabin, and that wasn't originally on this property.
It wasn't actually. That belonged to John Norton, who was a Mohawk chief, an adopted nephew of Joseph Brant. And it was brought here in the 1990s to protect it. It was scheduled for demolition. And the previous owner of this house, being a historian and an archaeologist, John Jupian, was one of the few people who recognized the importance of that structure that built around 1817. And he saved it, brought it here to protect it.
You're in the middle of restoring this house. Will you in the future also restore the Norton Cabin?
This house we're going to restore it for what we want to use it for. The Norton Cabin's a little different. The Norton Cabin is in rough shape, and what we want to do is preserve it as an artifact. To do a traditional restoration of it would be to cover it up with simulated layers, trying to make it look like it might have looked. We don't want to do that. People, when they come to see the Norton Cabin, they gravitate to it because in the decay over time, you see the history of it. So to preserve it as an artifact and use it as a touch point to celebrate the legacy of John Norton and the legacy of the relationship between the Six Nations peoples and the Loyalists is really our goal with that.
What are some of the things you're doing for this restoration of the house?
Well, what we've been doing up to this point largely is community outreach, trying to reach out to people and understand what they wanted, what they'd like to see here and what this space means to them. And from that, building on the history of the house, we've come up with some great programming ideas, and we're ready now to move into the interior restoration of the house.
Can you talk a little bit about your podcast?
Well, the podcast is a new initiative, actually. It's called the Open Door Podcast, inspired to a degree by John Norton. His Mohawk name, Teonin Hokorawin, means the open door. And the podcast was a way of reaching new audiences. Not everybody consumes media the same way. Some people want to hear it, some people want to watch it, some people want to read it. And the podcast has done great because it's brought in a new group of people who are interested in history. It's a different way of telling stories. Historians are storytellers.
You also have some multimedia presentations that you do?
Right now we're running our Road Ahead presentation, which is really a way of sharing with the community our plans for the site. It's a much more detailed summary of the community outreach, of the market research that we've been doing, and let people know, hey, this is what we want to do here as we move forward into the very complicated permitting and permissions step, which is what we're facing next.